Winter of 1886, Sognefjord, Norway. In a secluded village on Norway's west coast, surrounded by deep fjords and perpetually snow-capped mountains, everyone had prepared for winter in the same way for generations. Houses reinforced with pine logs, windows covered with elk hides, provisions buried underground to prevent freezing. It was the only way to survive. But on a small property in a village called Vikuri, two brothers were doing the exact opposite. While the neighbors hammered boards against the windows, they dug up the floor inside the barn. While the others watched the sky for signs of the first storm, they disappeared for hours under the animals' straw. Nobody understood. Nobody asked. They are children of the sea. They don't know what a real winter is, they used to say. These young people won't last until January. But when the most brutal snowstorm of the century arrived before December, when villagers burned the beams of their own roof to keep their children alive, not a drop of smoke came out of the brothers' farm. And that was what chilled the neighbors to the bone. The story of Leif and Astrid. Leif was 24. Astrid was 20, the children of fishermen who disappeared in a shipwreck. They inherited a small property on the rocky slopes of the village, near an old barn that had stood since the Viking era. They did not attend church. They rarely exchanged words with the other villagers. They lived off what they cultivated, what they fished, and what they planned in silence. During the first winter, they discovered the hard way that the house wouldn't hold up. The firewood disappeared in hours. The central stove seemed to spit out cold instead of heat. Astrid developed sores on her hands from rubbing her fingers against the rocks to warm them. Leif lost weight at an alarming rate. But one night, while feeding the animals, Leif noticed something strange. Inside the barn, where the cow and the sheep were, it wasn't so cold. The hay insulated the ground. The stone walls, nestled against the fjord's slope, kept the wind out. There was silence, and there was warmth, a type of warmth that their home never offered. The following spring, before the ground froze, they began to dig, in the dark, in silence, under the barn, in the invisible shelter. No sound of hammering, no request for help, just discrete buckets of earth being dumped on the slopes into holes that looked old. From the outside, they were just cleaning the stable, but underground, they were building something that would never be accepted. A secret shelter, a survival chamber, made with stacked stones, clay, and gravity, 7 feet below the surface. The ceiling was supported by wood from old ships that had sunk years before. Leif worked the joints with precision. Astrid hid the cracks with clay and dried moss. The entrance? A trapdoor hidden under the thickest hay with a short ladder made from parts of broken sleds. Ventilation? A pipe made from old, hollowed-out ram's horns, sealed with wax and clay. The fire? Small, invisible. A stone oven fueled with cured wood which produced almost no smoke. It was invisible, and that's why it was perfect. The cold arrives. In mid-November, the fjord awoke covered in ice. North winds brought a temperature of 20 degrees. Inside the houses, children were crying from the cold. In the churches, prayers were offered for a less harsh winter. But on the brothers' farm, there was no smoke. There was no sign of life. Astrid went to the village to buy flour. People looked at her as if they were seeing a ghost. "Are you still alive?" a woman whispered. "How do they heat their food without a chimney?" Astrid did not respond. He paid. He returned. Leif knew. They were starting to attract too much attention, but it didn't matter. In the underground chamber, it was possible to sleep without freezing your feet. It was possible to wake up without seeing the breath frozen in the air. Water in the storm. In mid-December, the heating started to fail. The floor was damp. The stones were too cold. Astrid noticed water seeping through the cracks. The land, saturated by the melting snow from an unusual rain, threatened to erupt. They dug trenches. They redirected the water. They used straw, stone, and faith. The shelter held, but the cold intensified even further. The houses in the village began to crumble from the inside. The wood was cracking. Chimneys were clogged with ice. A boy died of hypothermia on the Bjorna farm. And then, for the first time, a neighbor knocked on Leif and Astrid's door. Leif didn't open. He waited. The next day, 2 more arrived. Astrid went upstairs and looked around the barn. He saw desperate faces. "Please," they would say. "How are they surviving?" She hesitated. He looked at Leif. He shook his head no. But she replied, "Listen to the ground." They listened. The muffled sound of a steady flame, heat coming from below, not from above like in other homes. The truth, at last, was beginning to emerge. The underground legacy, By the end of January, the cold weather began to recede, but something had changed in the village. Leif and Astrid were no longer strange legends. They were survivors. Their camera became a symbol of ingenuity. Gradually, neighbors asked to see, learn, and in the following winters new chambers appeared, hidden, adapted, silent, but all inspired by what two brothers dared to do when nobody believed. The sky had been gray for days, not the pale gray of impending snow, but a heavy, thick tone, as if something were suspended in the air, waiting for the right moment to fall. The temperature rose during the day. It was plummeting at night. The fjord seemed to trap moisture between the mountains, like a lung that refused to release air. Astrid was the first to notice. "The shelter is different now," she said, placing her hand on the stone wall. Leif felt it too. Not cold. Something worse. Humidity. Astrid suggested turning off the fire for one night. Just one. For testing. To see how the earth would react without trapped heat. It was a mistake. The following morning, the thermometer read just over 4 degrees C, but the floor, it was damp all the way to the center, and the east wall showed dark, irregular spots, clear signs of water infiltration. The hay above had absorbed water and passed it on, drop by drop, through the wooden floor. It wasn't dripping, but that was enough to transform heat into cold vapor. Leif spent the entire day reinforcing the wall, tamping dry earth between the stones with his bare hands until his fingers lost feeling. Astrid cut up old cloths, tied them between the ceiling beams, creating small makeshift curtains around the oven, trying to keep the little heat concentrated. On the third night, the clearest warning came. The trapdoor swelled. The boards had absorbed moisture. The lid barely moved. "If this continues," Astrid said quietly, "we're not going up anymore." Leif remained silent. "We'll have to sleep upstairs tonight. Wasting firewood? We have no choice." They went up. The house looked abandoned, free, inert, as if she had been left there by someone who had already given up. The windows were opaque. It took almost an hour for the stove to start. They slept fully clothed, boots, without actually sleeping. In the early morning, Astrid went downstairs alone to check the camera. He slipped on the last step. One of the ceiling panels had come loose, and the corner where they used to sleep smelled to mofo. She didn't say anything until dawn. When Leif looked at her, she simply said, "We'll sort this out today." And the camera was alive. They worked without exchanging a word. They opened small air vents at the top of the west wall, creating cross-ventilation. They adjusted the chimney to force the hot air to circulate, instead of it being trapped in one spot. Leif heated stones in the oven and placed them under the platform, an old technique that he remembered hearing from older fishermen. Astrid dug a new, deeper pit at the lowest point of the chamber. He filled it with dry twigs and loose stones. He placed a bucket. At the end of the day, there was water at the bottom. That's when they understood. The earth was sweating. It wasn't raining, but the humid air trapped by the hay, the animals' bodies, the stagnant heat, condensed. The camera wasn't malfunctioning. She was breathing incorrectly. It was a timing error. Too much time without air exchange. Too much time spent standing still in the heat. The solution seemed absurd. Open. In the middle of winter. Let the wind in. Little. Short. Controlled. At dawn the following day they opened the trapdoor. They let the wind blow across for 3 minutes. Astrid was timing herself with her father's pocket watch. The cold cut like a knife, but it took the moisture away. The following night the thermometer rose. The stone dried up. The mold has stopped growing, and for the first time the camera seemed to breathe with them, not against. But when the valley almost broke, January arrived like a shadow. On the 9th, the sky went completely dark. On the 10th, the temperature dropped more than 20 degrees in 12 hours. The wind wasn't blowing. He was pushing. The houses groaned. In the village, families were burning furniture. In the Danton household, the fireplace devoured wood like dry straw. Samuel broke a bench in half. The children trembled, covered with everything they owned. That same night, Leif and Astrid went downstairs early. The fire had been burning for hours. The stones were warm to the touch. Outside, 39 degrees. Down there, 12 degrees. Leif pressed his forehead against the wall. Not out of gratitude, in fact. It worked. But they knew. The rest of the valley was left to chance. Is when someone saw on the third day of the storm the wind subsided for 2 hours. That was enough. Samuel Danton went out with a flashlight. I thought I would find bodies. It felt hot. Live animals, Stirred hay, vapor noir, and a voice, coming from beneath the ground. Is anyone up there? The trapdoor opened. Astrid came first. Clean. Calm down. Mr. Danton? He went down, and he understood everything without needing an explanation. The next day he returned with Margaret's daughter in his arms. The child slept there. The fever broke. Then others came, one by one. They didn't ask. They were just going down. And they learned. And what changed wasn't the barn. The barn did not become a symbol. It became a benchmark. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't normal. But he resisted. In the spring, the excavations began, not out of rebellion, but from memory. In the village, a phrase began to circulate. They didn't dig to hide. They dug to endure. And when the next winter came, the valley was no longer the same, because two people had the courage to try first, and that, sometimes, it's everything that changes the course of an entire winter. And if you want to keep hearing stories like this, of ordinary people who survived when no one believed in them, subscribe now, because the next story might be exactly the one that changes the way you see the world.